In the early morning of July 15, 1892, a boy was born in Knoxville, Tennessee, who would one day redefine courage in the face of unimaginable odds. That boy was Henry Johnson, an African-American man whose story would become a testament to bravery, perseverance, and the unbreakable spirit of those who fight not for glory, but for the lives of others. Henry Johnson grew up in a time when the United States was still grappling with the injustices of segregation and racial inequality. Opportunities for African Americans were scarce, and the shadow of discrimination hung over every aspect of life. Yet, from a young age, Henry showed a spark of determination. He was strong, resourceful, and fiercely independent. A young man who understood that his path would be defined by his own choices and courage. In 1917, when the United States entered World War I, Henry Johnson saw a chance to serve his country. At a time when African Americans were often relegated to menial tasks and denied the recognition given to white soldiers, Henry enlisted in the New York National Guard, which later became the 369th Infantry Regiment, famously known as the Harlem Hellfighters. This regiment was composed entirely of African American soldiers, but despite their dedication and valor, they faced prejudice both at home and within the military. From the very beginning, life as a soldier was challenging for Henry Johnson. Training was rigorous, and the expectations were high. The men of the Harlem Hellfighters had to prove themselves constantly, not only to the enemy, but also to those who doubted their abilities because of the color of their skin. Henry embraced this challenge with unwavering determination. He trained tirelessly, honing his skills with weapons, hand-to-hand combat, and survival tactics. But he also carried a deeper motivation, to demonstrate that courage and honor were not defined by race, but by action. In the spring of 1918, the 369th Infantry Regiment was deployed to France, joining the Allied forces on the front lines. Henry Johnson faced a new reality almost immediately. The horrors of trench warfare, the constant threat of artillery and machine gun fire, and the ever-present danger of poison gas attacks. Yet even in the mud and chaos of the trenches, Henry's character began to shine. His fellow soldiers quickly noticed his courage, his calm under fire, and his willingness to put himself at risk for others. Life in the trenches was grueling. Soldiers endured rain, cold, and vermin, often living in waterlogged trenches with limited food and medical supplies. Morale was low, and fear was constant. But Henry Johnson carried a quiet strength that inspired those around him. He would share his food, help the wounded, and keep spirits high with stories, jokes, or a reassuring hand on the shoulder. He understood that heroism wasn't only about fighting. It was about protecting, encouraging, and standing as a shield for those who could not protect themselves. The defining moment for Henry Johnson came on May 15, 1918, in the forest near the village of Richbourg-Gellevue. It was during a night raid by German soldiers that Henry's bravery would etch his name into history. The enemy attacked with overwhelming force, attempting to break the lines and destroy the regiment. Most men would have fled or surrendered under such pressure, but Henry Johnson did neither. Alone, armed with only a rifle, a pistol, and a combat knife, he fought relentlessly through the darkness, engaging the enemy in hand-to-hand combat. He was relentless, striking fear into the attackers while protecting his fellow soldiers from being overrun. What makes this act of heroism truly extraordinary is not just the skill and strength Henry displayed, but the sheer willpower and determination. He suffered multiple injuries during the battle, including gunshot wounds, bayonet stabs, and severe lacerations. Yet he refused to retreat. He continued to fight, moving through the chaos to save the lives of his comrades, even when exhaustion and blood loss threatened to overwhelm him. By the time reinforcements arrived, Henry Johnson had single-handedly thwarted the enemy raid, killed several German soldiers, and prevented a potential massacre. News of his bravery spread quickly through the ranks. His fellow soldiers spoke of him in awe, calling him a man of almost superhuman courage. The French government, recognizing the significance of his actions, awarded Henry Johnson the Croix de Guerre, a prestigious military honor, making him one of the first Americans, and notably one of the first African Americans, to receive such recognition for bravery in combat. Yet, despite this extraordinary heroism, Henry Johnson returned to a country that still did not fully recognize his sacrifices. In an era of segregation and racial prejudice, African American veterans often returned home to limited opportunities and continued discrimination. Henry's courage on a battlefield was celebrated abroad, but overlooked at home, a stark reminder of the inequalities that African American soldiers faced, even as they fought valiantly for their country. The story of Henry Johnson is not just about a single battle. It is about resilience in the face of systemic injustice, about the power of courage, and about the enduring human spirit. It is about a man who, against every odds, refused to allow fear, prejudice, or pain to dictate his actions. It is about a soldier who embodied the highest ideals of service and sacrifice, proving that heroism comes not from recognition or medals, but from the willingness to protect and defend others, even at the risk of one's own life. The night of May 15, 1918, would forever change the course of Henry Johnson's life. His body bore the scars of battle, gunshot wounds, bayonet cuts, shrapnel embedded deep his flesh, but his spirit remained unbroken. In the forest of Richbourg-Bellevue, he had stared down overwhelming odds and emerged a hero. Yet, as the smoke cleared and the battlefield fell silent, the story of Henry Johnson was only just beginning. In the days following the fight, word of Johnson's incredible stand spread quickly through the ranks of the 369th Infantry Regiment. Soldiers whispered about the man who had fought off nearly 24 German raiders almost single-handedly. His comrades admired not only his skill, but his sheer determination, how he kept fighting even after his rifle was destroyed, even after blood soaked his uniform, even when every breath was filled with pain. For the men of the Harlem Hellfighters, Henry Johnson was living proof that courage had no limits. But recognition came first not from America, but from France. Deeply impressed by his bravery, the French army awarded Henry Johnson the Croix de Guerre avec Palme, one of France's highest honors for valor. He was the first American soldier in World War I, black or white, to receive this distinction. The French celebrated him as a national hero. Newspapers in Paris hailed him as Black Death, a soldier whose ferocity in battle struck fear into the enemy and whose bravery inspired his allies. For Johnson, the medal was not a symbol of personal pride, but of something much greater. It was proof that African American soldiers, too often doubted or dismissed, were every bit as courageous and capable as any others. The men of the Harlem Hellfighters had already been fighting bravely alongside the French, enduring some of the longest tours at the front lines. Henry's honor was a reflection of their collective sacrifice, a declaration that their blood, sweat, and courage mattered. Yet, as Henry Johnson basked in recognition abroad, a painful truth lingered in the background. His own country did not see him in the same light. While the French hail him as a hero, in the United States, newspapers barely mention his name. White soldiers returning from the war were welcomed with parades and honors, but black veterans often returned to societies still deeply entrenched in segregation and racial prejudice. For Henry Johnson, this painful reality would only grow clearer in the years to come. Physically, the battle had left him shattered. His wounds were severe, and while he had survived, he would never fully recover. Shrapnel lodged in his body caused constant pain. Nerve damage left him with limited use of one arm. Nightmares haunted his sleep, as memories of the brutal hand-to-hand fight replayed in his mind. But perhaps the deepest wound of all was the way his country turned its back on him after he gave so much. When Henry returned to the United States in 1919, the Harlem Hellfighters marched in a grand parade through the streets of New York City. Thousands lined the streets to cheer them on, waving flags and celebrating their return. The regiment, which had fought longer on the front lines than any other American unit, was hailed for its discipline and valor. Henry Johnson marched proudly with his brothers in arms, his French medal pinned to his chest. For a brief moment, it seemed that recognition might finally come, but the moment was fleeting. While France celebrated him, the U.S. Army did little to honor Johnson. He never received the Purple Heart for his wounds. He was denied the Medal of Honor that so many believed he deserved. Worse still, after his discharge, Johnson found himself with no pension, no medical care, and little support. The same government he had risked his life to defend abandoned him when he needed it most. Despite his struggles, Johnson refused to remain silent. In 1919, he spoke out publicly about the treatment of African American veterans, exposing the hypocrisy of a nation that called black soldiers to fight for freedom abroad while denying them basic rights at home. He described the violence, the discrimination, and the neglect they faced upon returning from war. His words were bold, unflinching, and deeply uncomfortable for many Americans, but they were the truth. Yet speaking out came at a cost. Johnson, already struggling with his health, found it difficult to find steady work. His wounds made physical labor nearly impossible, and without proper medical care, his condition only worsened. Poverty soon followed. Once hailed as a hero in France, Henry Johnson slipped into obscurity in his own homeland. Still, the story of that night in 1918 never faded entirely. For the men who fought beside him, Johnson was immortal. Veterans of the Harlem Hellfighters told and retold his story, passing it down like a sacred legend of courage. They remembered how he fought with a rifle until it broke, then with a BOLO knife, then with his bare hands if that was all he had left. They remembered how he refused to surrender, how he saved his fellow soldier Needham Roberts from capture, how he stood as a wall between his comrades and death itself. Henry Johnson's life in the years after the war was a tragic contradiction. Honored abroad, forgotten at home. His story symbolized not only the bravery of African-American soldiers, but also the injustice they endured. He had given everything, his health, his future, his peace of mind, to protect his fellow soldiers and serve his country. Yet in return, he was given little more than silence. In the next part of this story, we will follow Johnson's painful journey after the war, his struggles with poverty, his fight for recognition, and the way his health declined under the weight of wounds that never healed. His life became a haunting reflection of America's unfinished battle with equality, a reminder that sometimes the bravest heroes are the ones who are forgotten. But the legend of Henry Johnson, Black Death, would not die. It waited in the shadows, destined to rise again as future generations rediscovered the courage of one of America's greatest unsung heroes. When Henry Johnson returned home from the battlefields of France, he carried with him not only the weight of his medals, but also the heavy burden of his injuries. The night of May 15, 1918, had left him a legend among his comrades, but it had also left his body broken. Shrapnel embedded in his flesh caused constant pain. Bayonet wounds left scars that never healed. Nerve damage crippled his ability to use one arm. Though he had fought like a warrior, his life after the war was a battle he was not prepared for. At first, there was celebration. The Harlem Hellfighters received a hero's welcome when they returned to New York in 1919. Crowds lined the streets as the all-black regiment marched down Fifth Avenue, their heads held high, their uniforms shining in the sunlight. Henry Johnson, wearing his Croix de Guerre pin proudly on his chest, was one of the most talked-about men in the unit. For a moment, it seemed that America might recognize the heroism of the men who had given so much. But the applause faded quickly. The reality of post-war America was cruel, especially for African-American veterans. Segregation and racism were still deeply entrenched. And while white soldiers were rewarded with benefits, jobs, and opportunities, black veterans often returned to poverty and hostility. Henry Johnson was no exception. Despite his injuries, Johnson was denied the medical benefits he desperately needed. The Army never properly recorded the severity of his wounds, and as a result, he received no disability pension. Each day was a struggle. The pain in his body made physical labor nearly impossible, yet he had no other way to provide for himself. Jobs were scarce, and employers showed little sympathy for his condition. Slowly, the war hero who had once been celebrated on the streets of Paris and New York slipped into poverty. But Johnson was not a man who stayed silent. In 1919, he began to speak publicly about the discrimination faced by African-American veterans. He gave speeches describing the hypocrisy of a nation that called black men to fight for democracy abroad, but denied them basic rights at home. His words were bold and unfiltered. He criticized the government, the military, and society for their failure to recognize the sacrifices of black soldiers. This courage to speak truth came at a cost. His outspokenness made him a target. The more he spoke, the more doors closed to him. Employers avoided him. Politicians dismissed him. Even the Army, which should have honored him, turned its back. Johnson, who had risked his life to defend his comrades, now found himself alone, fighting a new kind of war against poverty, neglect, and indifference. His health continued to decline. The untreated wounds in his body caused infections and chronic pain. without proper medical care. His condition worsened with each passing year. By the early 1920s, Henry Johnson was living in near destitution. The man once hailed as Black Death, the fearless fighter of the Harlem Hellfighters, was reduced to struggling for survival on the streets of Albany, New York. Despite this tragedy, Johnson's spirit remained fierce. He never regretted his actions in France. When asked about that fateful night, he never boasted, never exaggerated. He spoke with humility, simply saying that he had done what any man would do to protect his comrades. For him, heroism was not about medals or recognition. It was about doing what was right in the moment, regardless of the cost. But the lack of recognition stung. Johnson had been awarded the Croix de Guerre by France, yet in America, he was ignored. The Army refused to award him the Medal of Honor or even the Purple Heart. The message was clear. His heroism mattered to the French, but not to his own country. This bitter truth reflected not only Johnson's personal struggle, but also the broader reality faced by African-American veterans across the nation. By the late 1920s, Johnson's life had become a haunting contradiction. On one hand, his story was still remembered among his fellow soldiers, told as a legend of bravery and sacrifice. On the other hand, in the eyes of the public, he had faded into obscurity. Newspapers no longer wrote about him. The government no longer acknowledged him. He was a hero forgotten by the very country he had risked everything to protect. The final years of Henry Johnson's life were marked by hardship. He struggled with alcoholism, a desperate attempt to numb the physical and emotional pain. Poverty consumed him. His health deteriorated beyond repair. By 1929, barely a decade after his return from the war, Johnson's body could no longer withstand the toll of his injuries and his circumstances. He died in poverty, largely unnoticed by the country he had once defended so fiercely. He was only 32 years old. For decades after his death, Henry Johnson's story remained in the shadows. His grave was unmarked. His name was absent from history books. The man who had fought off an entire German raiding party to save his comrades, who had earned France's highest honor for valor, was forgotten by his own nation. But legends do not die so easily. Among veterans, among the men of the Harlem Hellfighters, Henry Johnson's story continued to live. They told it to their children, who told it to theirs. Slowly, the tale of the Black Death resurfaced. Historians rediscovered his heroism, and advocates began to demand that America finally give him the recognition he deserved. The tragedy of Henry Johnson's post-war life is not just a story of one man. It is a story of an entire generation of African-American soldiers who fought bravely abroad only to return to inequality and neglect a home. It is a reminder that sometimes the greatest battles are not fought on foreign soil, but within the very society one seeks to defend. For decades after his death in 1929, Henry Johnson's name faded into silence. His heroism, once praised by the French, was absent from American textbooks, absent from military honors, and absent from the collective memory of a nation he had risked everything to defend. His story lingered only in fragments, in whispered recollections among veterans, in the pride of his family, and in the oral traditions of the Harlem Hellfighters, who refused to let the memory of their brother-in-arms vanish completely. The United States had turned the page quickly after World War I. The country wanted to move on from the horrors of trench warfare, and in doing so, it left behind countless veterans, particularly African-American ones, who were already fighting their own battles at home. Johnson, who had lived his final years in poverty, became a symbol not just of bravery, but of America's neglect of its black heroes. But legends are resilient. They survive in shadows, waiting for the moment to return to light. And Henry Johnson's legend was too powerful to remain buried forever. In the decade that followed, historians, journalists, and veterans advocates began to revisit the forgotten stories of the Harlem Hellfighters. As they dug deeper, Johnson's extraordinary night in May 1918 resurfaced. The more people learned about his one-man stand against a German raiding party, the clearer it became. This was not just a story of individual heroism. It was a story of America's unfinished struggle with justice and recognition. By the 1960s and 1970s, as the civil rights movement reshaped the nation, interest in the contributions of African-American soldiers grew. Activists and scholars highlighted the sacrifices of black servicemen who had been denied their rightful honors. Among them, the story of Henry Johnson emerged as one of the most glaring injustices. How could a man who fought so bravely, who had been decorated by France, die without recognition from his own country? The question demanded an answer. The first glimmers of justice came slowly. In 1996, more than 75 years after his legendary stand, President Bill Clinton awarded Henry Johnson the Purple Heart, a medal he should have received decades earlier for the wounds he suffered in combat. For Johnson's descendants, it was a bittersweet moment. On one hand, the recognition was long overdue. On the other, it was a reminder of how long the nation had ignored his sacrifice. But the push for justice did not end there. Advocates argued that Johnson's heroism went far beyond what the Purple Heart recognized. He had not only been wounded, he had displayed extraordinary valor in combat, protecting his fellow soldier Needham Roberts and fighting with impossible courage against overwhelming odds. They pressed for more, for the nation's highest honor, the Medal of Honor. In 2003, Johnson was posthumously awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, the U.S. Army's second highest award for valor. This was another step forward, but still not the ultimate recognition many believed he deserved. For years, the debate continued. Scholars published articles, documentaries retold his story, and community leaders demanded justice. Each step brought Henry Johnson's name further out of the shadows. Finally, in 2015, nearly a century after his stand in the forests of France, justice arrived. President Barack Obama awarded Henry Johnson the Medal of Honor, the United States' highest military decoration. In a moving White House ceremony, Johnson's descendants stood proudly as the medal was placed in their families' hands. President Obama spoke of Johnson's incredible courage, describing in vivid detail how he had fought through his wounds, saved his comrade, and single-handedly held back the enemy. He reminded the nation that Johnson had been overlooked for far too long, but that his heroism would now be remembered forever. The Medal of Honor was more than a medal. It was vindication. It was a recognition Henry Johnson had been denied during his lifetime. It was a statement that his story mattered, that his courage was part of America's legacy, and that his life, though cut short and marked by struggle, had left an indelible mark on history. Today, Henry Johnson's name stands proudly among America's greatest heroes. Schools, streets, and military facilities have been named in his honor. Statues commemorate his bravery. His story is taught as part of the Harlem Hellfighters' legacy, ensuring that new generations understand the sacrifices made by African-American soldiers in World War I. And yet, Johnson's story is more than just a tale of battlefield heroism. It is also a reminder of the cost and neglect, of the decades of silence that followed his sacrifice. It forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that America has not always honored all its heroes equally. By remembering Johnson, we are not only celebrating his courage, but also acknowledging the mistakes of the past and committing to doing better in the future. Henry Johnson's journey from forgotten soldier to national hero is a testament to the power of perseverance, truth, and justice. It shows that even when recognition is delayed, it is never too late to honor the sacrifices of those who gave everything. It also shows that history, though sometimes slow, has a way of correcting itself. Henry Johnson's story does not end with his death in 1929, nor even with the Medal of Honor awarded nearly a century later. His legacy lives on, etched in stone, written in history, and carried in the hearts of those who honor courage, sacrifice, and resilience. When we look at Johnson's life, we see not just a soldier, but a symbol. He represents the countless men and women who give everything for their country and ask for nothing in return. He represents the truth that greatness is not defined by medals, wealth, or recognition, but by character, selflessness, and the willingness to stand firm when everything is against you. Johnson's act on May 15, 1918, was more than a battle. It was a message to history. With only a rifle, a knife, and his bare hands, he held back the enemy and saved his brother in arms. He showed that true heroism has nothing to do with the color of your skin, your background, or the circumstances of your birth. It comes from within, from the heart, from the unshakable belief that some things are worth fighting for: freedom, loyalty, and life itself. His story also forces us to reflect on America's journey. Johnson returned from war to a nation that did not honor him, to a system that ignored him, to a society that failed him. Yet, in the end, justice prevailed. His Medal of Honor is not just his. It belongs to every forgotten veteran, every overlooked hero, every voice that fought to be heard. It is proof that history, though flawed, can be corrected. Today, Henry Johnson's name inspires beyond the battlefield. In classrooms, young students learn about the Harlem Hellfighters and discover that one man's courage can change history. In military academies, cadets study his stand as a lesson in resilience and duty. In communities across America, monuments and memorials ensure that his story will never again be buried by silence. Walk through Albany, New York, and you'll find reminders of Johnson everywhere. Statues, plaques, and schools bearing his name. These are not just tributes. They are promises. Promises that his courage will be remembered, that his struggle will not be forgotten, and that future generations will carry forward the torch he lit on that dark night in France. But perhaps the greatest legacy of Henry Johnson is the inspiration he offers to all of us. You don't have to be a soldier to learn from his life. His story teaches us that adversity does not define us, that when the odds are impossible, when the world turns its back, we can still stand, fight, and protect what matters. His example reminds us that true greatness comes not from what we receive, but from what we give. Imagine the moment when President Obama placed the Medal of Honor in the hands of Johnson's descendants. Nearly 100 years had passed, but in that moment, the past and the present came together. A wrong was finally made right. A forgotten hero was restored to his place in history. The applause that echoed to the White House that day was not just for Johnson. It was for every soldier who has ever been overlooked, for every hero who has waited too long for recognition. Henry Johnson's life is a full circle, from poverty in Albany, to the battlefields of France, to decades of neglect, to finally being honored as one of America's greatest soldiers. It is a story of pain, yes, but more importantly, it is a story of triumph. His name now stands alongside the greatest heroes of American history, and that is where it will remain forever. In remembering Henry Johnson, we remember what it truly means to be a great American. It is not about power or glory. It is about courage in the darkest moments, loyalty to your comrades, and the willingness to sacrifice everything for a greater cause. Johnson embodied those ideals. That is why his story, once nearly lost, now shines brighter than ever. And so, as we close this chapter, let us carry Henry Johnson's legacy forward. Let us teach his name, honor his memory, and live by the values he showed us on that battlefield in 1918. Let us never again allow any hero to be forgotten, no matter who they are or where they come from. Henry Johnson once stood alone in the darkness, surrounded by enemies, bleeding, broken, yet unyielding. Today, he does not stand alone. He stands with us, with history, with every American who believes in courage, justice, and honor. His life is a story, his sacrifice is a lesson, and his legacy is eternal. Henry Johnson is, and will always be, a great American. But Johnson's story is not only about a single night of valor or a medal awarded decades later. It is also about the deeper meaning of legacy. What does it mean for a man's actions to echo across time? What does it mean to inspire generations who never met him, never heard his voice, never saw him march in uniform? Henry Johnson teaches us that legacy is not about fame in the moment. It is about the lasting impact of courage and sacrifice. His bravery, buried for decades, still found its way back into the light. His life reminds us that truth has a way of breaking through silence, no matter how long it takes. When students read his story, they learn that greatness does not come from perfect circumstances. Johnson was not born into privilege. He had no wealth, no political power, no connections. He was a young black man in a segregated America who chose to serve a country that often did not serve him in return. And yet in that choice, in that courage, he carved his place in history. That is the kind of story that shapes character, that inspires people to rise above their own struggles. For veterans, Johnson's legacy is a reminder that their sacrifices matter, even if recognition does not come immediately. His Medal of Honor, awarded nearly a century late, stands as proof that the fight for justice can endure beyond one lifetime. For communities, his name represents resilience. For America, his story is both a triumph and a challenge. A triumph of courage, and a challenge to ensure no hero is ever left behind again. Henry Johnson is not just remembered, he is celebrated. And as long as his story is told, he will continue to stand as one of the greatest examples of what it means to be a true American hero.